Speaking of James Southcott, please clap for James and Braeden talking about identity and access management. Very exciting.
All right. So this is Intro to IAM with me and Braeden. Who am I? I'm a second year honors BSMS CSEC from Rochester. I'm local. Go Bills. I'm on the CCDC team. I do Windows. I don't have any CC. Oh yeah, in the middle. There's us at regionals. Green board. I'm on the RITSEC Red team now. I'm a GRC intern at a local real estate company. I'm on the club volleyball team. That's a lot of fun. I play a lot of sports. Play a lot of spike ball, golf, hockey, tennis. If anyone's interested in playing hockey, we have an IAM hockey team. It's not like through RITSEC, but there's like a handful of us in it. So if anyone's interested in playing IAM hockey, yeah? All right. Yeah, I know. I asked you guys to do it, and you said no. Huh? Tech crew. Tech crew? Tech crew? I don't know. I just show up. Follower of Christ, and I love Chick-fil-A.
So hi, I'm Braeden Villano, second year CSEC major. I'm from the Hudson Valley area of New York. I do Linux for CCDC, and then networking if we ever need that. Not really much. I'm big into like heavy metal, and I also play guitar, so come talk to me about that. Oh yeah. And then I currently work as a tutor in the GCIS Tutoring Center. All right, so what is identity access management? So identity, that's who you are. So think of like your user account. And then access management, that's what you could actually like access on a system. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about authentication, authorization. We're going to get into the principle of least privilege. And we're going to talk about some centralized ways of managing IAM. So like Windows Active Directory, Red Hat IDM, and Entra ID. So authentication, that's how you could verify who you claim to be. So some key methods, something you know, that's like your password or your PIN for your account. Something you have, you could think of that like a smart card, a hardware token, like if anyone has like a YubiKey, something like that. And then also like a one-time password. So like think of like the Duo authentication notifications you'll get on your phone when we're logging into like My Courses, something like that. And then something you are, that's like biometric data, your fingerprint, facial recognition, stuff like that. And then multi-factor authentication, that's when you combine two or more verification methods that we mentioned above for increased security. So more than one factor makes it a lot more secure because it's harder for attackers to kind of spoof that. And then authorization, that's what you can actually do on a system. So it determines like your permissions, access levels for anything from like a system to a network. There's different methods of it. Some common ones are role-based, which is users assigned roles. So like your job title might be something, and those roles are given permissions, and you inherit your permissions from that role. You can have attribute-based, so based on something like a department, job title, maybe even like office location. And then policy-based. A lot of IAM solutions will let you define policies, defining like access levels. Access control list, super common form of access management. It's a list of permissions specifying who has access to a specific resource and what actions they perform. It's formatted as kind of like a list specifying like subject and then what rights they have. We have two examples here. One, the bottom one, that's implementation of an ACL in a Linux like directory. In the top, we have like a firewall rules, which you could think of really just big ACL. So principle of least privilege. A user should only have the minimum access or permissions necessary for their job. So you don't want your finance department to have access to your code base to make and edit your code. They don't need that for their job, so they shouldn't have it. Only the essential permissions to be granted, really. And you should review and adjust your access regularly, so that way people who no longer need access don't have it anymore. The benefits are it minimizes damage in case the account is compromised if they can't access things that they don't need to. It's required for a lot of things like HIPAA, GDPR, and other standards. And then also, it helps with insider attacks because they aren't able to access as much sensitive information, especially if they don't need it. So what should centralized IAM look like? It should have mechanisms for authentication and authorization like we talked about. It should have a way to manage users for your organization. And it should have like a central repository for your user and policy. And then it should also have like a way to do single sign-on across services and devices. You don't want a different password to like log into your computer, log into your email, log into my courses, something like that. You want just one login that you can use for everything.
All right, so now we're going to get into our first centralized IAM solution to see a lot of how this type of stuff is implemented. Asa loves this one, Windows Active Directory. So it was released with Windows Server 2000, which actually came out in 1999. One very important part of this, AD is a hierarchical structure. The actual service is called Active Directory Domain Services, and you can do a lot of stuff with this. Manage users, computers, printers, apply all the policy you need, and most importantly, authentication and authorization. So about this hierarchical structure, this is very important to understand within Active Directory. So our highest level is our forest, right? That's this big blue box right here, right? That's the highest level. Everything is in the forest. Your company has one forest, or should only have one forest. Usually it's like the same as like the domain name. Windows kind of like messes with it a little bit. They'll like put it in all caps or sometimes. So like we have an example, google.com, rit.edu. The domain is a logical way to partition this forest, right? So this green triangle is a domain. Users and groups are defined at the domain level, and authentication and authorization also happen inside the domain level. This is super helpful because a good example is when you buy a company, right? You don't want to have to like re-import all of those users, redefine all their access, right? You just want to like have a smooth transition technical wise. You can just insert that as a new domain, right? And now everybody should be working seamlessly now, and now you've just got another domain under your forest, right? So like when you start a company, you're going to have one forest, one domain, but as your company grows, you're going to want to scale that into multiple domains. Inside these domains, we have two smaller logical units. One's an organizational unit. This is used to apply different policies that you want to use as a computers. And then we have groups. That's used to apply permissions. So understanding domains. The most important computer in an Active Directory environment is the Active Directory Domain Controller. This handles everything. If you lose the DC, you have lost your domain. Yeah. They can control computers, files, printers, literally everything. They can control your DNS. They can do a complete denial of service attack if they have control of the DC. Authentication and authorization also happen in with the DC between a client and the domain controller via Kerberos. Braeden will talk a little more about Kerberos later when we get to Red Hat. And then on the DC is the Active Directory data store. There are three actual like storage components: the directory system agent, the actual database, which is stored in this directory, C Windows NTDS, which is very important, and the extensible storage engine. And then for interfaces, two of the most important ones, LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. So whenever you try to access users or groups from the domain controller itself, it's going to use LDAP, and you can also configure LDAPs, which is basically just the it's LDAP over TLS, so it encrypts with AES and checks the certificate beforehand. And then SAM, your security accounts manager, that's what stores the actual credentials themselves. All right, group policy. Group policy is extremely important in AD because you don't just want clients joining and then being able to do whatever they want, right? You want to actually be able to enforce your policy. So group policy objects, you're able to create them within your domain controller and then specify them how you want and determine the scope of how they should actually be enforced, right? So if we have an organizational unit that is made for HR, that group policy shouldn't be enforced domain-wide, right? It should only be enforced on the organizational unit that's made for HR. So some policies you can enforce, these are type of things that you would want to enforce domain-wide. Users can access control panel, networking settings, the behavior of the elevation prompt, right? Typically, when you go to elevate just on your standard laptop that's yours, it'll just say, do you want to allow this file to make changes to your device? And you'll say yes. That's called the elevation prompt on the Windows Secure Desktop. If you're in an actual company environment, that's going to make you retype in your credentials. And you're only going to be able to do that if you are an administrator. Users cannot change the company background. That's important because that's something that threat actors will mess with. And then audit logs, because those are obviously important. As I said earlier, group policies are applied to organizational units. All right, users, computers, and groups. We actually need our users to be able to do stuff in our environment, right? So user represents the account that someone uses, right? So a perfect example is our RIT accounts, right? Mine is JMS9508. That's one user that exists in RIT's Active Directory. And a computer. So a good example of this is, has anyone ever used like the computers in the library before? Yes. Okay, I'm not the only one. So those computers are domain joined Active Directory computers, right? You can sign in with your Active Directory account, and then it'll use LDAP to take all of the files that pertain to you, your access. So like a common error with these is actually it won't be able to like set up the printer configurations. That's LDAP breaking, right? So if you've ever seen that little error message when you try to sign in on one of the library computers and it takes a long time, that's what's happening in the background. Like so, all of those computers are like in our Active Directory domain, right? And then groups. They contain users or computers, right? So if you're on one of those library computers, there's probably a group that's named First Floor Library Computers. And all of those computers can send like a print job over to the printers that are on the first floor, right? Because we don't want just anyone being able to send like stuff to that. That wouldn't make sense. We only want those computers to be able to print to that. And then groups, right? All of us are probably in one giant group called GCCIS students or cybersecurity students, right? So just some logical ways. And then like access control lists are defined from here, right? We are going to be able to access stuff that people in the College of Business might not be able to access to, right? They won't be able to get to our lists, right? Only people that are in the group CSEC students are going to be able to actually like authenticate to our lists. And so one important thing we mentioned earlier was SSO, right? But I didn't mention SSO in all when I was talking about ADDS because SSO within Active Directory is actually its own thing. It's called Active Directory Federation Services. It's a separate machine that you have to set up. So something important to think about when you're setting up Active Directory is you actually have to have physical servers that you were installing Active Directory on. We'll get to that more when we talk about Entry ID and the differences, but you actually have to have a physical server. And so if you want to set up Active Directory Federation Services, you have to have another separate server. And depending on how big your company is, you're going to have to buy more and more of these. It's a separate deployment, separate service that's running. A perfect example of this is Shibboleth. Everybody uses Shibboleth because you have to, we're RIT students. And I'm not sure if anybody's actually taken a look at this like thing when you're on Shibboleth, right? So .ad.rit.edu, that is going to be the domain or forest. rit.edu is going to be the forest. ad.rit.edu is going to be the domain. And then main is going to be the main one. They likely have a backup one or a test one that they use for testing deployments before they want to roll something out user-wide. And then Shibboleth is going to be that actual Active Directory Federation Services webpage that you hit, right? So I don't know if anyone's actually paid attention to this. This little login part right here, this will change based on what is actually trying to authenticate to Shibboleth. Is there any way to move this little thing with this? Because I want to talk about the stuff right here. That's all right. I don't know if anyone's actually looked at this, right? So /identity profile SAML, that's security assertion markup language. That's basically a way of having whatever website you're trying to authenticate to send the authentication request back to Shibboleth and then redirect because you're not authenticating through whatever you're trying to authenticate through before, right? So if I'm trying to go into, this isn't a good example, my courses, right? My courses is redirecting me to Shibboleth and then Shibboleth redirects me back. And then behind this little box right here, you can see it says SSO. Right, so that's a perfect example of Active Directory Federation Services is Shibboleth. Now we'll get into Red Hat IDM.
All right, so with Red Hat IDM, a lot of this stuff is going to sound very similar to the Active Directory stuff we just talked about because they really didn't want to reinvent the wheel. They took a lot of this stuff and really just made a Active Directory type thing made for Linux systems. So Red Hat IDM, it stands for Red Hat Identity Management. And it's an IAM product by the Red Hat company for Linux system. It's specifically made for RHEL, but you could use different clients. And then it's also basically the same as another system called FreeIPA, which is the community-driven open source project that RHEL IDM is based on, just with added enterprise support and integrations with Red Hat products. So why use it? It's a centralized identity management across Linux servers and endpoints. It makes it really easy to manage and apply policies, privilege escalation rules with like pseudo groups for who could actually sudo, and gain super user permissions. It can provide like single sign-on. You could also set up to do like multi-factor authentication, one-time passwords through it. And you could set access control rules for all the machines joined to the domain. It could also integrate with Active Directory, which is really awesome for mixed OS environments where you have part of the network running like Active Directory, but you also have some Linux machines that you use. You could actually integrate that so your Linux machines can be authenticated to by your Active Directory. We'll get into that at the end of this section. It includes support for native Linux tools and features, so you can actually manage the Linux machines like they are Linux machines instead of like Windows. It includes support for things like SE Linux, and you can deploy it across multiple servers called replicas for load balancing and redundancy, which if you're using this for like a home lab, you don't really need, but when you get to like an enterprise level network, it's something that becomes very important. So the components of it, a lot of the same components as Active Directory. It's built on Kerberos, certificate authority for like public key infrastructure. You have the DNS server and a network time protocol server, and that's interacting with the LDAP server, which could also be LDAPs. And then you also have a management interface, which could be through the command line, or it could also be through HTTP, which kind of got cut off by the captions. But so Kerberos, that is an authentication protocol. It was developed by MIT. The current version, which I believe is version 5, was published in 1993, and it's made for securely authenticating users in what can be an untrusted network. So you don't want to have like a ton of passwords flying over the network. Instead, it uses tickets. And it's really commonly used in enterprise IAM like Active Directory, Red Hat IDM, stuff like that. So how does it work? So it begins with the client making an authentication request to the Kerberos authentication server. If the client can successfully authenticate, it's granted a ticket granting ticket and session key. And then when it wants to actually access the service, it's going to send its ticket granting ticket along with the request to the ticket granting server. If that ticket granting server, which is also part of Kerberos server, can authenticate it, it'll send back a service ticket and the credentials encrypted with that session key it was gained earlier. And then the client could send the request to the access to the application server using that new service ticket, which you could then use to authenticate it. So that way you don't need to be using like passwords all the time. You're going to be using tickets instead. It's a lot more secure. Next up is network time protocol. So that's an internet protocol for synchronizing clocks across devices based on time servers. So you might be asking, like, why is that important for an identity access management system? So a lot of the authentication protocols, especially Kerberos, they rely on accurate timestamps. So, like, for example, if you've ever tried to join a computer to, like, an Active Directory domain when the timestamp is way off, it's not going to work. So that's why something like this is used. It can also prevent replay attacks, which you can think of it as, like, an attacker grabbing, like, your ticket and trying to retransmit it to get access. It could help prevent that by ensuring the time is synchronized so that the timestamp will be expired, so they can't do that. That way they can't manipulate the time on their systems, stuff like that. And it could also ensure that timestamps and logs use the same time across different systems. So like if you have a ton of different things reporting back to like a SIEM, it's going to be really difficult if they have different timestamps to figure out like what's happening on different systems at the same time if you had like an intrusion. So this is a big help for that. DNS is also a big part of it. Just to recap, it will translate domain names into IP addresses for computer networking. And this is critical to IDM as it allows services and clients to find one another using the SRV records. And you could also manage using the integrated DNS server all the DNS records for the whole domain. You don't need to spin up like your own DNS server. You can just use one integrated already with Red Hat IDM. So there are two main ways to interact with IDM. The first one is through the CLI. It uses the IPA command line utility, which is the same thing as free IPA, like we mentioned earlier, because they're basically the same system. It's super useful for scripting and automating. So like this year when we saw this at CCDC, we spun up some scripts to automate like disabling users, changing passwords, things like that, to make it a lot simpler. We did all that using the IPA command line utility. And it provides a lot more like low-level control. You can be a lot more specific with it. And it's very efficient if you have like large numbers of users to automate it instead of just trying to do it manually through the GUI. But we also do have the web UI, which is super nice. You can see it's a pretty simple view to be able to find everything pretty easily. It communicates over HTTP/HTTPS. It's a lot more accessible. It's got a lower learning curve, and it gives a really clear visual view. You could actually spin up it'll show you the whole topology of your network, which makes it super easy to kind of visualize what your network looks like, what's joined to your domain. And then finally, we're going to get into what we talked about earlier, which is cross-forest trust. So it supports a one-way trust with Active Directory, which is where it'll basically trust everything from Active Directory, where users from your AD environment can connect to your Linux environment. So how it does that is it presents itself as another forest, which to the Active Directory domain, and it trusts your Active Directory domain so that the users can authenticate, kind of see the diagram. So this way you can still manage your Linux clients with Linux native tools, but you can still use it with your AD infrastructure, which makes things a lot more simplified. Okay, so next we're going to get into Entra ID.
So, what is Entra ID? Entra ID was formerly known as Azure Active Directory. That name honestly made a lot more sense because that's exactly what it is. Azure is everything Microsoft Cloud. If you've ever worked with anything Microsoft Cloud before, literally everything has the word Azure in front of it. They love promoting it. They kind of shifted everything that was in their identity portion to this Entra area, right? So the main product is Entra ID. It's Azure's centralized IAM solution. It's basically built to do the same thing as AD, but it's cloud-based, so it's better. And it also has way more features than Active Directory. This is a good question. Someone asked me this a couple weeks ago when I did a Windows presentation. One of the most important features of Entra ID is it's pay-as-you-go. You just have to set it up the first time, and then you pay based on how much your business needs to use Entra ID. Versus in Active Directory, you have to buy literal servers, right? And if you're a big business, if you're setting up Active Directory for the first time, that's a lot of servers. That's a lot of money. So some more key similarities and differences. Some similarities. Users, groups, organizational units, domains all still exist, right? That's kind of crucial to the whole IAM solution. Big difference. Entra ID is not a hierarchical structure as opposed to Active Directory. Azure is a hierarchical structure itself, where you have organization and then your subscription. This just separates billing, right? So if you want to bill each department based on how much they spend in your Azure tenant, you can do that. And then just resource group and resource. Everything in Azure is a resource. So if I want to spin up a VM, that's a resource. It's called an Azure VM resource. If I want to spin up a database, that's a resource. Everything in Azure is a resource, and then you segment those into resource groups. Subscription just separates billing. But Entra ID itself is not a hierarchical structure. Users and groups can still be organized hierarchically with groups, organizational units, administrative units. But by default, when you just make a user, it just kind of exists in your Entra ID tenant. There are way more features in Entra ID. Conditional access policy, PIM, user sign-in risk, SSO, MFA, dynamic groups, administrative units. We're going to get into all of those. So the first thing that's awesome with Entra ID, MFA is built in, and it's default. Entra ID has this set of security defaults that are very useful. Honestly, the most important one is MFA. It's not as good as you would like your MFA to be. It will, whenever a user signs in for the first time, it will give them 2 weeks to actually register their MFA with the Authenticator app. That's the default. You can also set it up to use, we use Cisco Duo at RIT, or you can specify what authentication methods you want them to be able to use. By default, it will use the Authenticator app, and it'll give them 2 weeks to set that up. But you can set up MFA to be significantly more strict. But it is nice that by default, if you don't have anyone technical in your business and you just want to set up Entra ID, you'll have MFA already set up for you. How to make MFA more secure? That's through conditional access policies. Conditional access policies are an incredibly strong tool. It's Microsoft's implementation of the zero trust principle. They are just a giant set of policies that you can create and apply based on whatever scope you want to, right? So if I want to take all of my domain administrators and put them into a group, right? And then, an organizational unit. And then I'm going to apply a conditional access policy that is going to harden the crap out of their account, right? They have to have only one method of MFA, right? Only the Authenticator app from this iPhone. They can only use the Edge browser to do that. They can only sign into the Azure portal from this IP address from the Edge browser, right? You can really get granular with how much you restrict people, and they're pretty awesome. So these are some example conditional access policies that like I've used in the past just to apply blanket company-wide. User must use MFA, right? That's the most important one. Every sign-in attempt, you must use MFA, right? That's one that we have to do every time, right? Another one that you might not think about. Most companies are not that big, right? They're only going to have employees in the USA, right? The user must like be using an IP address that's located in the USA. User sign-in risk, we're going to get to that later. It must be something lower than high, right? So it can be low, or it can be none, low, medium, or high. If it's high, there's a good chance that account's been compromised. So you can set it to, if a user sign-in risk is high, you can just deny their attempt, or you can force them to reset their password, or it can send a notification to a certain administrator, like a user administrator, and they have to reset the password for them. You can get really granular with what you want to do. Another one, if all of your employees are in the same time zone, they can only sign in during business hours. If they're not going to be doing any type of work outside business hours, why should they be able to, right? We don't want someone signing in at 4 a.m. when that person could be signing in from a foreign country that they're not supposed to. And then another good example, right? If you don't have any people working remotely, likely your actual business owns one IP address that they're using for their internet connection. They have to sign in from that internet address, right? Why would they be signing in from anything different? We got a little quote from Asa at the bottom. That's Cap, because this is Cap. PIM. This is Microsoft's implementation of just-in-time access. It's a great way to manage privileged identities within Enter ID. So in in just regular Active Directory, you kind of just have users that are going to be more privileged than others, right? So a way to get around that was what I've seen is you'll have your regular account, and you'll have like my account would be james.southcott@rit.edu, and then like if I have admin firms, I would have admin james.southcott@rit.edu, right? So I would only sign into that admin account when I needed to do something very specific. Well, that's still not great, because if that account gets compromised, like the admin account can still be compromised on its own. So privileged identity management allows you to give users the ability to elevate to higher permissions when they need to, and you can do a bunch of stuff with it, right? So by default, you can like just specify a reason, and like you don't always have to specify a reason, but you'll set the amount of time you need it for, and then you activate. It'll verify that you are authorized to activate that elevation, and then you'll have those roles or permissions, whatever is assigned with that, for that certain amount of time. You can control how long someone's allowed to elevate for, so it can be 24 hours, it can be 30 minutes. Good examples of this, right? So a domain administrator, right? They don't always need domain admin permissions, right? But let's say they have to do something specific. Let's say something big has happened, right? And they need domain admin creds because they're gonna be messing with some important settings. They can elevate for an hour, and then after that hour's done, after they fix everything, they just have normal access. Let's say you're a developer and you're building some cloud applications. You can use PIM to give access to resource groups in Azure, right? So you have privileged identity management to access that resource group, and you activate that, and you only have access for that amount of time, right? So you only have access for 10 hours. Once you're done developing that application and you're going to a different one, well, I'm only going to need a couple hours. I'm just debugging something, right? Only activate for a couple hours for that one. So that is super important. And then another good one, right? Security engineer. You don't want them having constant 24 access to do anything they want security-wise in Enter ID, right? But let's say they see an alert from their SOC. Let's say they get an alert from ASA. We've got a user sign-in risk high. This guy's compromised. You need to do something about it. And you get a call from SRA, right? You need to do something about it. Well, then you'll go and activate your security operator role so that you actually have the necessary perms to fix that situation. So PIM is an awesome tool. User sign-in risk kind of works hand in hand with both PIM and conditional access policies. User sign-in risk automatically works in the background for every single user sign-in, and it will designate low, medium, high risk based on a variety of factors. We listed a couple of them here. I think there's like 150. I was looking at the Microsoft Learn page earlier. Some common ones: anomalous geolocation, right? If everybody in your business signs in from the US and then you get a sign in from Russia, that's like kind of weird. Or like a sign in from like Brazil. Like, why is someone like that? That might fool the business hours one, right? But that's not going to fool the geolocation one. Too many MFA fails. That could be a pretty obvious one. Using a VPN. unless your company actually uses a VPN, you shouldn't be using one. Anomalous tokens, so that can detect stuff like replay attacks and if your session token was stolen. IP usage, right? You can, if like a user is signing in from, like let's say it's someone who works remote, but then so I've seen this one before, like a user always signs in from New Jersey, right? And all of a sudden they're signing in from San Francisco. That shouldn't be happening, right? That like it's a different IP. Weird times, right? 4 a.m. Why is someone logging into the HR system at 4 a.m? Shouldn't be happening. New devices. So if a user signs in for the first time on their device for the first time, or if they register a new method of MFA, a new device for MFA, this will set off a lot of false alarms with your SOC, but you'd rather have those false positives than false negatives. I mean, like I've seen stuff before, like someone just like signed in like to like their email on Safari for the first time, right? And that set off their user sign-in risk as high. But it is still a good indication of something's fishy. You should probably check it out. So single sign-on. Single sign-on is built into Entra ID, so unlike Active Directory, you don't have to set up a whole new server. It's actually really easy to set up. Again, I use Shibboleth as a good example. All you have to do is create an enterprise registration, and you have to set up a couple things. You have to set up a couple URLs, the redirect URL, and where to send the actual authentication like approval back to. And it's super easy. You can set the scope of it really well, so you can set the scope of it to only a specific group, and then only that group will be able to sign into that SSO application with their Entra ID credentials. And most applications, if you set it up correctly, actually allow you to just bypass the actual authentication screen. Yeah, you have a question in the back? Does Entra ID still use LDAP? I have no clue, to be honest. Entra ID does speak Kerberos when you're using Entra Hybrid. I don't know if it uses LDAP. That's a good question. I'll look into that later. But yeah, so like if only, let's give an example. Only HR should be able to sign into the HR admin portal, right? So only HR is going to be in that group that is allowed to SSO into that admin portal. And if the application supports it, it'll actually just autofill the credentials for them. So like you'll just click on the app in the My Apps screen in Azure, and it'll just take you straight to the site. You won't even realize that in the background, SSO did your authentication for you. Dynamic groups. This is a super helpful way to automate a lot of your user group computer infrastructure. You can set it based on a variety of things, based like, the job title, the department, your manager, all types of stuff. Whatever a user has like in their user profile, you can set a dynamic group to add them to a group for that stuff. Super helpful, especially if you have a really small IT team in a big company. Dynamic groups are an awesome way to automate a big part of your job. Administrative units. These are a key part of Entra ID. An administrative unit is basically just a logical container where only the people in that group can edit other people in the group, right? So let's say I am the administrator for the School of Engineering, right? And the School of Business, a student comes to me and says, hey, I've got a problem, and I want to go edit their account. I can't. Only the administrator within the School of Business can actually edit that account. This is super helpful if you want to like maybe create an administrative unit for some of your really privileged users. Even though you're using PIM already for those privileged users, you can still put them in an administrative unit to just have like defense in depth, right? You want to apply as many of these as possible. So these are a super good way to be able to do that. Also, help desks are a very big target of threat actors. Lots of companies don't have the proper authentication set up correctly when you are actually reaching out to your help desk, right? So you may be able to social engineer someone in your help desk to reset a password, even though it's not actually you whose account it is, right? But if I like reach the wrong help desk person, let's say I reach the help desk person for the School of Engineering, and I ask them to reset someone's password in the School of Business, they're not going to be able to do that, right? So a super helpful tool. Can eliminate some risk. You still should have good methods in place for authenticating when you are doing help desk stuff, but this can alleviate some of that risk. Okay, so everything we've been talking about so far is like like the actual management of identities. But what about the actual devices? Because AD did that for us. Well, this is Microsoft Intune. Microsoft Intune is a great way to manage all of your. Okay, well, Intune's pretty great. Intune can manage all of your devices for you. Think of it as it can apply all of those group policy objects that we talked about in Active Directory. It does that, but this is the cloud-based version. Enter ID is a prerequisite for using Intune, but Enter ID does have a free version if you want to set up a free version to use Intune. Basically, all you need to enroll device is sign in with that user, like a user that is in your Entra tenant on that device, right? So I sign in with james.southcott at rit.edu, and now whatever device I just signed in on is now enrolled in RIT's active Entra ID Intune. So from Intune, you can do a variety of things. Actually, I think I have that on the next slide. Yeah, you can control so many settings. It's awesome. You can apply configurations to all of these. So a couple common ones. BitLocker, right? Every device in the company should probably have BitLocker. Firewall, you're going to want to manage the firewall settings for that. USB settings, right? You don't want anyone to just be plugging in USBs willy-nilly. That wouldn't be great. What applications they're allowed to go to. Intune can manage the applications that you're actually allowed to access. The behavior of the elevation prompt, like we talked about earlier. Allow time before updates need to be done. This is a very important one. If there is a critical security update that Microsoft has released, we don't want the user waiting 2 weeks before they actually install that. It should be way earlier than that. Access to things like Control Panel, the Microsoft Management Console, PowerShell, command line. And then these policies, very similar to group policy, can be deployed at whatever scope you want, right? You can deploy them company-wide. You can deploy them to all of your Windows machines, all of your Linux machines, all of your iOS devices. You can deploy them to a very specific organizational unit. You can really get granular. You can apply it to one device, right? If you have one person that's in charge of your entire IT structure, if you're a really small company, 40 to 50 people, and you only have one person in IT, you can just apply it to their device. And then Intune can give you awesome reports. If I quickly need to know what devices have a certain application on them, right? So if I just got a notification from our SOC that this application has a 0 day, right? Easily, and then it's being exploited in the wild, right? I want a quick report of what devices have that application and what devices have that application version that are affected by the bug, right? So I can force an update on it. So that can give you a quick report. That takes like 30 seconds to do in Intune. You can see what devices are up to date on their policy, what devices haven't updated in a while, what are compliant. Yeah, all kinds of stuff you can manage with Intune. Oh, it's my favorite part. Need water though. All right. So what if I want all of these cool Entra ID features, but I already have a bajillion dollars invested in Active Directory? Because this is probably the case for a lot of big companies. Active Directory was released in 2000. So between 2000 and like 2015, when Entra ID was released, they had a massive Active Directory. We call it a footprint, right? They had a lot of money actually invested in that. They had ADDS, ADFS, certificate authorities, web servers, all of that. They already had servers for that. We don't want to get rid of that, but we still want conditional access policy, PIM, SSO, MFA, Entra Hybrid. Active Directory, as we said, extremely popular. You still want to use that. Entra Hybrid just allows you to use your on-premises Active Directory in conjunction with an Entra ID tenant. There are 3 types of Entra Hybrid. All 3 of them will utilize Entra Connect to synchronize stuff like users, groups, everything directory-wise will be synced with Entra Connect. And then Entra Connect Health will allow you to monitor the health of the connection between your Active Directory infrastructure and Entra ID. So the first one, password hash synchronization. This is the very simplest one. It is very lightweight. All that happens is your password hashes are sent from Active Directory up to Entra ID. And then authentication happens in the cloud. This is very simple, very bare bones. If you have a small IT team, this is a great way to still get all the benefits of Active Directory without having to manage Entra Hybrid. So here's a little graphic for that one. Wow, that's really bright. As you can see, right, the password hash just gets sent up to Entra ID. A sign-in happens right here, and then a user gets application access. Very simple. The next one, pass-through authentication. This is kind of the reverse. The password gets sent from Entra ID, and then the authentication happens in Active Directory. It's also quite lightweight. All that is needed is a agent on each one of your domain controllers, and it's nice because it actually doesn't expose an outbound port, because that would have significantly more security implications. It doesn't expose an inbound port. It exposes an outbound port. So basically, it just makes constant calls up to your Entra ID to see if there are any users waiting for authentication. If there are, it'll handle that for them. So here's a little graph for pass-through authentication. So you can install multiple authentication agents on each domain controller, and it'll reach out to Entra ID. And whenever there is a new password or authentication attempt, the password will be sent back to Active Directory. It'll authenticate or deny, and then tell Entra ID, and then the user will get to sign into whatever SaaS, Azure, Office application they want. If you're wondering why there is some difference between this pass-through authentication and password hash synchronization, this can be a requirement of certain companies or three-letter agencies where certain things need to happen in their on-premises infrastructure. Businesses love cloud because it's not us handling it anymore, right? It's the big company. It's Microsoft. It's Amazon. It's Oracle. It's IBM, right? That is a great part for them. But if you work for the DoD, that's kind of scary because now Microsoft is in charge of not getting breached, right? If you have confidential information, you have sensitive information, stuff that is only accessible to people with top secret SCI clearance, now Microsoft gets breached and now it's out there, right? It's Microsoft's fault, not yours, because you trusted Microsoft and Microsoft got breached. But if you have all of that stuff in your on-premises infrastructure, that blame is no longer on them. Now the actual information, now the authentication is happening on your end. It's not happening in the public cloud. So that is a big difference between pass-through and password hash. The most involved one is federation integration. So this takes ADFS, what we talked about earlier, enabling SSO for Active Directory, and then integrates it with Entra ID. And I'll be honest, don't ask me how this works because I have no idea. It's pretty complicated. Yeah, it's pretty sweet though. Yeah, the authentication request goes to the federation proxy, which then goes to ADFS. I don't really know what happens from there though, but RIT, this is how probably is actually set up, right? When we hit shibboleth, you're hitting the Entra ID ADFS Federation proxy right there. You're not actually talking to an on-premises Active Directory Federation service, because Entra ID has so many tools that a big organization like RIT would actually want to use. These are all the sources. If you want to learn anything about anything Microsoft I just talked about, just type whatever it was. So conditional access policy and then Microsoft Learn. I think every single documentation tool I used was Microsoft Learn. More sources. And now, does anyone have any questions? I'm going to research that question from earlier. Thank you, Drew. Yeah.
Would you say that an RIT ID is ID access, and you have to manage that?
What?
Would you manage it with a lanyard?
It's like Chase Case
Can I do it?
Can I do it? Chase is still here.
I have to try.
I'm gonna announce the demos. Where's the mic at?
There's no mic. You have to yell.
Oh, you just gotta go.
Okay.
Okay.
Wait, I have an answer to this question from earlier. Yes, Entra does still use LDAP for its primary form of directory access. So I think it's like really hot right here. I'm sweating right now. But yeah, Entra ID does still use LDAP the same way Active Directory does.
Yeah.